Good afternoon. I hope everybody got some lunch and everyone who wanted to got to see the Collins Hours. Was it pretty great? I didn't get to see it. Was it great? It was great. Awesome. All right. Good to hear. So my name is Dot Porter, and I'm here at the Schoenberg Institute. I'm the curator for digital research services. So one of the things that I do in my job is I'm the co-PI of the Bibliotheca Philadelphiensis project, which you might have heard about a little bit. And now we have little cards for it. So there are cards about the project on the back table just outside the elevators. So if you want to take one of these, it will tell you all about all the great manuscripts that we're digitizing, that we have been digitizing in Philadelphia, including the Collins Hours. So you can go online and see it in your house if you want to. One other thing before we actually get started with the session, somebody lost an earring. It's a little green stone, little hangy stone. No? Okay, well, if you hear someone saying that they lost an earring, we have it up here. Thank you. So now on to the session. This is the second paper session in our symposium this year. The topic is Narrativity. The first speaker is Alexandra Green from the British Museum. Alexandra Green is Henry Ginsberg Curator for Southeast Asia at the British Museum. She has a PhD on the subject of 18th century Burmese wall paintings from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. In 2014, she curated an exhibition entitled Pilgrims, Healers, and Wizards, Buddhism and Religious Practices in Burma and Thailand, and this was at the British Museum. She has a new book out, which is very exciting, from the Hong Kong University Press, Buddhist Visual Cultures, Rhetoric and Narrative in Late Burmese Wall Paintings. Her current work is on the relationship between word and image in late 20th and 21st century Burmese religious popular posters. And she has a major exhibition she's working on Sir Stratford Raffles collections, which will be at the Asian Civilizations Museum, January through April of next year, and at the British Museum, September 2019 through January 2020. So she's doing wonderful work, and we're excited to hear you speak. Alexandra.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and I want to thank Lynn Ransom and Nicholas Herman for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I've been fascinated by the papers, and I really realized that art history is a massive discipline, and we approach it in so many different ways, and especially people working on Asian material. I almost feel like I'm at a completely different type of conference. So one of the things that's really struck me is that you have or I should say, European specialists have the luxury of focusing on, say, just a manuscript or just a few manuscripts and not actually looking beyond that. We don't have that luxury in Asia. In Asia, you are automatically interdisciplinary when you're looking at material simply because we don't have enough objects remaining and things aren't kept in the same way that they are here. So, and I'm also a little bit of an interloper because I'm not a manuscript specialist. My specialty is very much wall paintings and looking at wall paintings within a larger religious and social context. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the relationships between manuscripts and wall paintings with a focus on the 18th and 19th century in Burma. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that actually for most of the time period, we don't actually have any manuscripts. We don't have any illuminated manuscripts. So really, the earliest illuminated manuscripts that still remain date from the very late 18th century, and then we only have a few copies. So really, it's not until the mid-19th century that you suddenly have a lot of material remaining. So there are definitely things that you have to extrapolate when you're looking at this material. So illuminated manuscripts in Burma were produced in concertina fashion on a wide variety of subjects. They range from things like sumptuary laws to processions of the court and Buddhist biographical stories. If you unfold them in their entirety, the latter type would present long sequential images that combine visual narratives with textual ones. This format is actually replicated in wall paintings found in temples scattered around the Burmese dry zone, and the substantial interplay between the two reveals the intertwined relationships of texts, manuscripts, images, and as you will see, trade in 18th and 19th century Burma. So the wall paintings not only mimicked specific textual and visual manuscript forms, but they also indicated the fundamental role of narrative in a wide variety of religious and social practices. Both manuscripts and murals played important roles in maintaining the Buddha's teachings, the Dhamma. They made him present to devotees through a variety of techniques, including representing hagiographical events in contemporary settings, and provided a means for practitioners to generate merit to ensure good future rebirths. This paper explores the physical, religious, and textual ways that manuscripts and murals participated in contemporary society, generated the Buddha's presence, brought his community into the present, and rendered religious and social benefits to the donors. And I should say, a lot of what I'm talking about is really grounded in a whole range of specific Buddhist concepts, which if you're working on 15th century European material, you simply won't know, but there are two things that you should really bear in mind. One is that the Buddha taught that everything's impermanent, and that includes the religion. So one of the things is that people try to do is they replicate images of the Buddha, they replicate manuscripts in order to try and stave off that decline as long as possible. And the other thing to think about is the fact that you don't have a single life in Buddhism. You die and then you're reborn, and then you're reborn again. And everything about you is determined by your behavior in this and in previous lives. So if I behave badly in this life, in my next life I might be reborn as a cripple or as somebody who's poor. So everything about you, how good looking you are, whether you're male or female, it's better to be male, how wealthy you are, all that is very important. So people make offerings to the Buddha, to the monkhood, to the religion, in order to not only to stave off the decline, but to make sure that they're reborn in a better life. And in particular, there are a whole series of Buddhas. A Buddha is simply an awakened being. And so we have another Buddha coming in about, well, it depends on which sect you're dealing with, in about 2,500 years. And his name is Maitreya. And people, if you're born as a human in a pretty good condition when Maitreya is around, then chances are you will also become enlightened. You will also become a Buddha. So people want to ensure that they are in a sufficiently good status to become enlightened during Maitreya's time. So if you bear those issues in mind as I'm going through my paper, then you'll understand it a lot better. So just very quickly, I'll show you some various types of manuscripts that you get in Burma. We have, manuscripts are produced on a wide variety of materials. Paper is one of them, and then there are two different types of paper manuscripts. There are black paper manuscripts like this. Oftentimes, this is a very fancy one, it's been illustrated. Oftentimes they are not illustrated, but they're used as copybooks. So they're written, you have white writing on them, then that writing can be erased and they can be reused. You also have, I know this is all covered in paint, but this is actually a white paper manuscript, and these are used to illuminate, usually they're textual, but they're also visual, and they're used to represent stories of the Buddha's previous lives. This is an example in the British Library. The British Museum has almost none of these because, of course, when the two institutions split, the British Library took the manuscripts and the British Museum kept the objects. Then these are the most numerous type. These are palm leaf manuscripts, and we do have these going back several hundred years, and how they're leaves and then they're inscribed with a stylus, and then you rub ink or soot into that inscribing, and then your text obviously appears. These are usually used to copy out religious texts. So Buddhism has the largest corpus of religious textual material of all religions, and one of the things you can do to maintain the religion is to have it copied. So we have numerous versions of these various texts. And then you also have lacquer texts. So these will be on cloth or metal, and then you lacquer that, and then in many, many layers, of course, and then you apply gold leaf to do the design. So that was quite fun yesterday in the program, working with the gold leaf. It was, again, a very different way of applying it than you would in Burma. So these are the four main types. So I want to talk a little bit now primarily about the white paper parabaik, the white paper manuscripts, which are illustrated, and look at those in connection with the murals. So I'm looking at this as a sort of a series of vignettes, starting with very basic relationships, which is, of course, the similarity of subject matter. So, for example, we have here a white paper manuscript that we do have in the British Museum, and it's a cosmology manuscript. Buddhist cosmology is extremely complex, but this is a representation of the central mountain with its surrounding mountain ranges, and the rabbit is the moon, and the peacock is the sun. You also get it very occasionally on palm leaf manuscripts, so I hope you can see that the central core here is the same as on the paper one, and then you have your 7 mountain ranges here. And of course, you have your sun and your moon. And then we get the same thing in wall paintings. So here, this is a temple from those dates to 1813. Here's your central mountain range. You've got the 7 mountain ranges around it, and you've got your sun and your moon on either side. It has very strong connections with a specific episode in the Buddha's life, but I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so then what we also see between the manuscripts and the wall paintings is a strong similarity in both scene selection and in standardization. Standardization is a very important part of religious practice in Burma, and actually in South and Southeast Asia, particularly in relationship to wall paintings and manuscripts. Of course, convention facilitates understanding, and it also ties in very strongly with the oral tradition, where repetition enables you to remember things. And of course, Buddhism was originally an oral tradition. So actually many of the written texts replicate oral forms of recitation and memorization. And then we're seeing that also mimicked here. And so this, I just want to show you, is one of the Jataka, one of the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, where he's born as a king's son. And you can see there he is sitting, this is the Buddha to be, sitting as Prince Nemi on his father's lap while his father is condemning 4 criminals, and you can see the criminals here. And one of the things a Buddha to be and a Buddha can do is they can look into the past and they can understand this law of cause and effect, that if I do something bad today, that's going to have an implication in the future. So he realizes that he actually doesn't want to be king, because being king is actually is not a very meritorious thing. So he becomes completely, he pretends he's deaf and dumb. And they try and get him to be responsive again by torturing him in various ways. So here he is being attacked by an elephant, and here he is being attacked by a snake. And eventually the king gives up and says, take him out and kill him. And so here he is being taken out. He goes out and he's taken out in a chariot, and he upturns the chariot, persuades the charioteer not to kill him. And and it all ends happily, of course, where he preaches to the court, and everybody understands, and everybody becomes an ascetic. So that's so yes, stark realism. Anyway, but this is a late 19th century manuscript that actually is at Denison Museum in Ohio. Now, if we look at this in the wall paintings, you have the same thing. So you've got, there's the, can I see? Oh, here's the king. There he is sitting on his father's lap. Here are your criminals. And then here is another site where you can see him being tortured in various ways. And actually, there's a whole long series of tortures that happen over many, many years. And then finally, and I'm sorry, the wall paintings are extremely small and they're very difficult to get into, so it's hard to photograph. But here he is being taken out in his chariot, and there's the chariot being turned over. So basically, sorry, and I had another example, which are hell scenes. Hell scenes, of course, show you the negatives of your behavior if you behave badly. And one of the favorite things to do is to have people being boiled in a pot. And we get that in the wall paintings as well. This is 18th century. The manuscript is late 19th century. So again, incredible standardization over long periods of time. These are all stories and images that people would have been familiar with because monastic schools, which were the main form of schooling, would have been, everybody would have been educated to know of these. So if we think about this in terms of this repetition connecting with the oral tradition, and again, I will come back to that. There are also important connections between manuscripts in layout. So you have sequential stories. The stories follow each other. The scenes follow each other one after another. The stories are laid out in strips. They tend to start at the bottom of the wall and they work their way up. So you go from basically being more sentient to being closer to enlightenment the higher you are up on the wall, which ties in with cosmology. Now, one of the important things about Burmese wall paintings is that they replicate this kind of layout in terms of manuscripts, as opposed to other traditions in Southeast Asia, where this is Wat Dusi Dharam in Bangkok, and you can see that they have a whole scene occupying this massive wall. You simply don't get that in Burma. It always has this strip layout, even after we have an importation of Thai artists into Burma. You still have the same kind of long cause and effect strip layout, not utilizing the wall space as a whole. So Burmese murals really are distinctive among Southeast Asian wall paintings. And what's particularly interesting is that the emphasis here is on the process of telling. And again, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, there is another type of textual format with which the murals also connect, and this is a type of text called a nisaya. And a nisaya is basically a word-for-word translation from the Pali, which is the religious language, into the vernacular. And so you have a Pali sentence, then you'll have a Burmese sentence, and sometimes they even do it word by word. So you'll have a Pali word, and then the next word will be Burmese, and then the next word will be Pali, and so forth. And what you have here in the paintings is you always have this line of text beneath the imagery. And because of the structure and the grammar, again, too much for me to go into now, these are very clearly captions, and they're very clearly meant to be captions. So I have argued elsewhere that basically we could see the visual material as a Pali text because these are taken from specific Pali texts. And then with our vernacular, Burmese vernacular beneath, they are again kind of a form of a visual nisaya, that your prose and your image are really closely related. So why do we have this relationship between manuscripts and murals? Basically, manuscripts in Burma are sacred objects that are commissioned and donated to monasteries to make merit. Even today, this happens at a great rate. There are inscriptions from as early as the 13th century that amply demonstrate that books were donated to monasteries from a very early period. And actually, the sheer number of remaining manuscripts from the 19th century onwards on palm leaf, paper, metal, lacquer, show the significance of these objects in Burma and in terms of a Burmese religious practice. So these Bagan-era inscriptions also record the existence of libraries, and numerous monasteries, even today, house significant old manuscript collections. And there are some digitization projects that are happening, and the Pali Text Society is actually recording some of this material online. But I mean, there's a huge amount of material that could be worked upon that has not yet been. And again, this ties in, all these donations of manuscripts tie into that anxiety to slow the disappearance of the religion. So like manuscripts, I'd say wall paintings are a type of gift that can be made. So you would donate a temple with paintings, with sculpture, again, to hold off that decline, to make merit for yourself. And since manuscripts were such an important religious offering in Burma, the replication of a manuscript format in the murals suggests that the latter were then viewed as another type of, quote-unquote, manuscript. So these manuscripts as murals thus can be considered a form of textual offering to the Buddha for the perpetuation and the promulgation of the religion. And the murals themselves also make this concept of merit clear. And this is an image of the god Sciacca, or Thajaz, he's called in Burma, or better known as Indra, as the god Indra, who's been co-opted from Hinduism into Buddhism. But you can see him here at an entrance to a temple, and I hope you recognize that white thing in his hands as a concertina paper parabaik manuscript, and that he's writing in it. And what he does is he records people's karma, he records their levels of merit, so that then you know what's going to happen to you in the next life. More practically, information from the late 19th century indicates that court painters at the time produced both illustrated manuscripts and wall paintings, and therefore we could say that most likely earlier provincial painters may have done the same. The fact that manuscripts were used as copybooks may also have contributed to the production of a manuscript format on temple walls, and monks also supervised the production of wall paintings, and then they too were involved in the production of manuscripts, and there are quite a number of early literary figures who are also monks. So again, we have an incredible intermixing of what we would consider sort of sacred and secular, but really there's no separation in Burma. So I want to turn back to the layout of the narratives within temples very briefly. So the images wend their way clockwise around the temple. You always circumambulate around a Buddha image clockwise, keeping your right side towards the Buddha. And as I said, they start at the bottom of the walls and they spiral upwards. And this organization surrounds the temple's main images and the practitioner. So the spaces are very small. They're about 10 feet square inside, and so it's not a congregational space. So people would go to have a personal moment with the Buddha. And so the fact that they're surrounded, the main image and the practitioner is surrounded by retellings of the Buddha's biography, suggests that the Buddha image is the narrator, assisting people to understand Buddhist concepts in the temple, preaching to the devotee, linking text and oral recitation visually. Basically, the Buddha used narrative as his main didactic method. So again, these paintings are then not only following manuscript traditions, but they're also following, original oral practices from the very beginning of the religion. The images also make the Buddha present for the devotee, and they do this by showing everything in contemporaneous times. So there's no sense of presenting the Buddha's community as a past. These stories are not represented in the past. They're always shown in the here and now. And I show you this. This is a traditional example of Burmese wooden architecture. And we see here in the cosmology manuscript that I showed you earlier, a different section, you can see this replication of the same type of wooden architecture. And we see it here again in a late 17th century painting. But what we also see here are the women's headdresses, the women's clothes, the king's crown. Again, all of these things are of the time. So actually, they're fantastic records they are in fact the only records that we have of material culture from this time period. And then again, back to that other manuscript, you see how things have stayed the same yet have moved on. The textiles are slightly different, the royal regalia is slightly different, and so forth. So in this way, but the devotee being in this space, surrounded by images that are very familiar to him or her, they then become part of the Buddhist community. And again, this is a huge topic that I can't go into, but by being surrounded by the here and now, they are then also part of the Buddhist community, and therefore they move forward with him towards enlightenment. They move forward with his other devotees. There are also significant ritual connotations to this imagery, particularly two forms, something called Buddha Nusati and commemoration. So Buddha Nusati is the calling to mind of the qualities of the Buddha, and it's a devotional practice that's presented as numerically listed recollections, and it purifies your mind. So one of the things we get here is this repetition of specific stories, the 28 Buddhas of the past. You've got your 10 great Jataka stories, rebirth stories, and there are many others. So again, it's mimicking mnemonics, and it's also following very specific ritual practices. In terms of commemoration, Paul Harrison writes a commemoration as a calling to mind of individuals who cannot be remembered personally, whereby the act has a transformative function that enables the other to be interiorized. Commemoration of the Buddha through narrative in murals and manuscripts not only enabled devotees to participate in the ritual activities of the local contemporary community, but also transformed them into members of the Buddhist community in the process. The visual recollections of the Buddha set in contemporary society enabled participation in the Buddhist community and in turn affirmed the practitioner's normative role within the Burmese Buddhist community and purified him or her at the same time. However, so I've been talking very specifically about Burma, but this is actually part of a much wider world. Visual tellings of religious stories have a long tradition in South and Southeast Asia. The manuscript style of the wall paintings has other relationships besides manuscripts. In particular, the pata cloths used to tell stories publicly in South Asia, as well as South Asian manuscripts. So manuscript painting styles, particularly those from 16th to 18th century Assam, which is up in northwest of Burma, these pata story cloths, and the East Coast, the Coromandel Coast temple hangings of India share features with Burmese wall paintings, and actually with other wall paintings as well, Sri Lankan traditions and so forth. But basically you have a red background, the use of registers, a separation of narrative spaces with landscape features, wavy framing lines around the action, rows of figures paying homage, and the narrative occurring primarily along a single ground line. And I think you can see that quite clearly here between the wall painting and the temple hanging. So while story cloths don't appear to have been an art form in Burma, the similarities among the various forms of visual narratives in South Asia and Burma suggests a large cross-cultural milieu in which such material was conceived, circulated, and presented. I should add that these cloths were a luxury item in Burma. There's substantial importing of Indian trade textiles, and there were many parts of the paintings that replicated imagery from these cloths. So Burmese murals and manuscripts were thus part of extended networks that linked narrative forms, illustrative methodologies, oral and written literature, luxury goods, and religious activities and rituals. So I'm afraid this paper has really been a series of vignettes looking at the many ways in which Buddhist biography and cosmology are expressed across media and in relationship to multiple facets of society. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Christine Sciacca from the Walters Art Museum. Christine is Associate Curator of European Art, 300 to 1400 CE at the Walters Art Museum. She received her PhD, MPhil, and MA in art history from Columbia University and a BA in art history from Cornell University. Christine was curator of illuminated manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum for 10 years, and she has worked at several other museums, including the Cloisters Museum and the British Library. Her book publications include Florence at the Dawn of the Renaissance, Painting and Illumination, 1300 to 1350, Building the Medieval World, and Illuminating Women in the Medieval World. She is currently developing an exhibition on the art of Ethiopia at the Walters Art Museum, and I'm really excited to see that actually, and I'm really excited to hear your paper too.
Thank you, Nick, for fixing that. I'm even less qualified to talk about Burmese painting than I am to talk about Ethiopian painting, so I'm glad you switched the PowerPoint. Many thanks, and I apologize about my voice. I've gotten some baby cooties and developing a cold, so I will try to speak up for Lucy Sandler's sake and for nobody else's. I'm so grateful to the organizers for inviting me to speak today and to be again in a room with so many very eminent manuscript scholars and future manuscript scholars. Some of you know that I have gone over to the dark side, meaning medieval objects. So I'm very glad to be in the company of so many bibliophiles here today. Pardon me. Ethiopia represents the second oldest Christian nation in the world after Armenia, and its history of illuminated manuscript production is quite lengthy. The earliest surviving examples date to the 14th century, or perhaps a bit earlier, with the hotly debated Garima Gospels. This is very exciting stuff in Ethiopian studies today to know what do you think about the date of the Grima Gospels? Due to their structure and use, manuscripts can present images in series, what I refer to as here as serial imagery. They can present a continuous story that can extend across double-page spreads and throughout a sequence of successive folios as its pages are turned. These images can tell a narrative that progresses in a linear fashion, such as telling the story of the life of Christ. And here I show just one example from the Walters Art Museum, one of the earliest manuscripts in our collection, and a very early Ethiopian manuscript in general, where you have, believe it or not, Christ's crucifixion, although the absence of Christ we have instead of jeweled cross, but you do have the two thieves. I think you can probably pick that out. And then you have the how to say it, the Marys appearing at the tomb of Christ, and Christ is absent. So this is sort of the narrative as played out in the beginning, a prefatory cycle of the manuscript. But manuscripts may also present a repetitive series of figures. In 2010, the J. Paul Getty Museum acquired a remarkable Ethiopian gospel book that complemented two existing manuscripts in the collection from this African nation. This book, which I show on the screen, features an extended prefatory image cycle with a series of miniatures filled with a rhythmic arrangement of figures from the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. So it is this latter repetitive type of imagery that will be the focus of my talk today. So much for narrativity. Much has been said about narrative imagery in medieval art, but in fact less so about this sort of repetitious imagery. I would argue that this phenomenon seems particularly central to Ethiopian manuscript illumination, and it extends to other painted objects as well. And yet it is little recognized and discussed as such. In my paper today, I will first demonstrate how serial imagery manifests itself in various painted media, both on parchment and on panel, and I will discuss the effect of this particular type of imagery. Finally, I will suggest some reasons for the important role of serial imagery in Ethiopian art. The tradition of liturgical manuscripts, and in particular gospel books, was particularly strong during Ethiopia's history of book production. And I just show you one example here from the Walters Art Museum, an incredible example. If any of you have visited the Walters and you go through the kind of making of a medieval manuscripts room, which Abigail Quant and her colleagues have so nicely laid out, there is a large blow-up, not of this evangelist, but of the evangelist John from this very same manuscript. He takes up the entire wall. It's also a door to go through a staff area, so sometimes John opens up and the visitors all scream, and then we go back to our daily work. So here you have Matthew writing out his gospel, and you can see it's written quite clearly in as the liturgical language of Ethiopia, still used to the present day, that the text is written in on the facing page, and the evangelist is shown writing on the evangelist portrait. And this may look familiar to you from other examples of evangelist portraits you might be familiar with in Byzantine manuscripts, in European manuscripts from the Middle Ages. It's very much part of that tradition. This is quite strong in Ethiopia as well. So you have these evangelist portraits, but also at the beginning of this very same manuscript, and I should say it's from a place called Gunde in the Christian highlands of Ethiopia. This locale will come up quite a lot during my talk. This is from early to mid-16th century. This is actually the first illuminated page in the manuscript. And what you're looking at here is actually all those figures are representing the innocents in the massacre of the innocents. But I just want you to kind of keep this image in the back of your head. And then when you turn the page, you have this wonderful scene of actually the adoration of the Magi and the shepherds, but divvied up into kind of all these boxes and these different registers. And I really think there's a lot of resonation between Alexandra's paper and mine in terms of image creation and layout between Burmese and Ethiopian painting. And it faces a very iconic and very important type of image at this time in Ethiopia, the Virgin and Child seated together, framed by Saints Michael and Gabriel, who kind of act as an honor guard for the Virgin Mary and Christ. This is a very common image in manuscripts and in panel paintings, as you'll see. So this is the sort of main book type that you see coming out of Ethiopia in the Middle Ages. So just to throughout there. A lot of these things will be coming from gospel books. Returning to the Getty manuscript, MS 105, the most striking feature of the manuscript is what immediately follows the Canon Tables. So you see there's a series of Canon Tables leading up to this. That's the final one that you see on the screen. And then beginning with the page on the right, what you see is a series of 8 full-page miniatures, each of which features rows of prophets and the apostles arranged in 2 registers. Dominating the upper register of this first image is Abraham, the patriarch of the Israelites, who wraps his arms around the shoulders of his grandson Jacob and his son Isaac. Old Testament figures played a central role in Ethiopian Christian worship. And Marilyn Heldman has suggested to me in the past that the founding monk of Gundagunde, a gentleman named Estefanos, he himself encouraged his followers to read not just the New Testament, but also the Hebrew Bible as well. The prophets on this page also include Moses with the tablets of the law, and Aaron, the priest, swinging a censer. These features are inscribed, so many of them can be identified. See me later if you want further detail. This iconography appears to be a favorite one in Gundagunde manuscripts, and there are several others that follow in this vein. I'm really focusing on the Getty example here. On the next several pages, there is a veritable litany of figures. They function almost like a procession of these heavenly personages. Many of them have crosses inscribed on their robes, and each face is a little bit different, but if you kind of squint your eyes, it all looks like much of a muchness, sort of one figure after the next, kind of drawing your eye along by that cacophony of colors that you have, slightly alternating each time. And I'm just going to kind of cycle through these as I talk. Each one of the figures holds a different attribute. A scroll, for example. So even in the serial imagery, you have some differentiation. So this creates a lively procession through these prefatory pages. And that's just the final one there. Again, ending with this iconic image of the Virgin and Child. In 2014, the Walters Art Museum was given 3 parchment leaves illuminated on both sides, displaying a total of 6 miniatures, and I just show 3 of them here. These leaves remained uncatalogued until last year, when my colleague Lindley Herbert, curator of our manuscripts and rare books, suggested to me that they might make a nice topic for study for the Journal of the Walters Art Museum. And as with all things manuscript at the Walters, I turned first to our manuscripts conservator, Abigail Quant, and I hope she's still here. Are you here, Abigail? There you are. For her insights. So although the full-page format of the illustrations suggests that they represent a series of miniatures from a prefatory image cycle, kind of like we've seen before from a codex. And by the way, this manuscript is maybe about 5 inches by 5 inches square. And although the acquisition report for the leaves suggested that they were leaves from a hagiographical manuscript, Abigail had noted remnants of parchment lacing or stitching along one edge of each of the leaves. This is inconsistent with what you would see in a codex, with bifolia bound together with thread down their center margin. It is, however, totally consistent with a book type particular to Ethiopia. Ooh, I like that. That's and my ears perked up during Alexandra's paper, and you'll see why in a moment. These so-called censals, or chained manuscripts, consist of either a single sheet or multiple sheets of parchment sewn together and folded accordion style or concertina style. And I show on the screen one example in the Walters collection from the late 17th century. So this was a book type that persisted much later into to Ethiopian book production. When stretched to its full length, the viewer sees a series of scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, creating a special kind of continuous narrative, akin to prefatory cycles in Ethiopian gospel books, for example, but even more fluid in its presentation. When the censal is kept mostly closed, it can be leafed through like a book, and Griffith Mann has stated that a series of diptychs is created when you do this. Quite often, the centermost diptych in Ethiopian censals pairs an iconic image of the Virgin and Child with one of St. George, who was of great importance in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And this particular manuscript measures about 3.5 inches square. So you can imagine that this being used kind of like a devotional painting held in the palm of the hand for personal meditation. And I wanted to show you one other example of this type of manuscript. Rather than narrative scenes, another stencil from the same period displays a long line of equestrian saints. So these were very key and still are in the Ethiopian church. You have St. George here, but also many, many other equestrian saints kind of related to court figures at the time who would have been trained in the equestrian arts. And so you have these equestrian saints and these mounted saints being prayed to constantly, and they turn up in all sorts of different types of Ethiopian imagery. So you can imagine the user going through the images and saying prayers in succession to St. George, St. Theodore, and so forth. The ragged edges of the Walters leaves means it's really impossible to know for sure how the extant leaves were attached together, and even less so to know how many leaves in the series were lost, and what they depicted, of course. Nonetheless, there is a similar succession of saints punctuated by the Virgin and Child in the Walters leaves, as in the later 17th century example at the Walters. While much less plentiful than codices, stencils are not at all unusual occurrences in Ethiopian art. However, now that I've become fairly obsessed with this book type, I think we may find some single disbound Ethiopian leaves that were always thought to come from gospel books or other types of liturgical manuscripts. They may actually come from stencils. Based on the style of the miniatures on the Walters stencil leaves, I determined that they were likely produced at the monastery of Gunde in the Christian highlands of Ethiopia. The scriptorium there flourished in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, kind of into the mid-16th century, and it is the same source for the Getty Gospel book that I showed at the beginning. I'm sorry, and here is Gunde, the monastery of Dabra Garzen. This led me to further to a beautiful set in my work on the Walters leaves, a beautiful set of 3 large bifolia in Munich at the Museum fünf Kontinente, which I believe are by the same artist as the Walters stencil leaves. These display a mixture of narrative and also more iconic serial images. And I show here what you're looking at is on the left, the Ancient of Days, surrounded by the symbols of the 4 Evangelists, which many of you again might know from European imagery, and below the Baptism of Christ with some fantastic fishes swimming around Christ and John the Baptist. And on the facing page, attendant prophets who are all look to sort of be conversing among themselves. And also this bifolio. Oh yeah, I see. Actually, I saw Dot do this. Did you see the, yes. So in the lower register, second figure from the left, you have sort of the covering of the mouth. And that actually appears in the Walters leaves as well. Do I have him here? No, I don't. But he's on the back of one of these leaves, the same sort of gesture that you have there. And here you have these incredible, again, series of equestrian saints, which are lock, stock, and barrel the same as what you see on a couple of the Walters leaves, and facing a very, very similar Virgin and Child on the facing page. Let's see. When I had the opportunity to study these leaves in the flesh, as it were, manuscript joke, nobody laughed. I found that, like the Walters leaves, their outer edges were scored and folded and displayed stitching holes, sometimes filled with extant thread. And although these leaves are much larger, one could even argue they are a gospel book in scale, they were absolutely, I believe, sewn together concertina style. So what we're looking at here is obviously the overall leaf, this folded over parchment edge, there it is with the thread still in it. And then when you carefully lift the little tab there, you see sewing holes through it. Let's see. Okay. Another fascinating example are a group of 44 leaves in the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They display scenes from the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and at the end, various Ethiopian saints. When they arrived at the museum, they were fixed to a large board and not in their biblical order. But when one looks closely at them, however, you see that they display needle holes, often around 2 or even all 4 sides. Part of this is likely due to how they were attached to the support, but also along the long edges, left and right, there is evidence of multiple sewing campaigns, and I believe at least one represents the stitching that connected the leaves in a stencil format. And again, here you can see that the leaf is scored, the illumination comes right up to, goes right into the gutter, and you have that little flap of parchment where they were detached in a very, very rough sort of way, but it allows you to see how it was originally. It should really make you go, ooh. One incredibly rare object in the Walters collection that displays serial imagery is a liturgical fan. Only 3 of these are known to survive, or at least known to me to survive, and all come from the general region around Gundagunde. The other ones are in churches in Ethiopia. The Walters example consists of 5 sheets of parchment glued together, scored, and then accordion folded, like the stencil. Folded outward and attached to a stick, which you can see there. So you sort of affix one edge to your stick and then splay it out like a fan. I don't know if you think of those paper fans that you can buy. And attach the stick. So you have this very large parchment fan. These, of course, recall other sorts of liturgical fans that would have been made in other materials, so metalwork. They're basically to keep flies away from the Eucharist. But something like this, Marilyn Heldman has argued that this was actually created in response to the need for Marian icons at this time. So less for use in fanning, but more as a particular type of icon. Because what you have here is a series of figures, and you'll see it's a little bit hard to pick her out, but at the very center, right here in blue, we know about blue, is the Virgin Mary. So she's the centralmost figure. So when you splay out the liturgical fan, she's right at the top and the center. And all of the figures are surrounding her around the other side. And she's surrounded here by 38 Old and New Testament figures, as well as various saints. This need for Marian icons was instituted by Emperor Zara Yacob in the mid-15th century, and I'll come back to him. And in fact, this type of object was only produced in the second half of the 15th century. Again, we think near Gundagunde. So these objects are like portable icons rather than, again, fly swatters. And thanks to, again, the help of Abigail Kwan, I got some incredible pictures of this liturgical fan. If you lay the fan out and look at it sort of in this oblique way, and sorry, Abigail, I think you're making a little guest appearance in this photo. It looks like these figures are themselves processing along the manuscript. And so you can think of these not just the figures in motion, but obviously the icons themselves would have been processed. So imagine these figures being in motion in their original use. When viewed head on, the figures of the apostles and saints turn inward and they appear to converse with each other. So again, thank you to Abigail for making this photo happen. Now, up to this point, I've been speaking mostly about manuscripts, though maybe not in a manuscript in a format you might expect, not in a codex format. And I wanted to shift now to some art forms that beyond manuscripts that display serial imagery. And I really took to heart Nick's mention before about when paintings were in books, because in Ethiopia, that really was true up to a certain point in time, I should say, in books and on walls actually as well. So in the 15th century, however, you have this tradition of panel painting that begins in Ethiopia. And this is around the time of the Ethiopian missions to Europe and the arrival of Italian painters at the Ethiopian court. And I wanted to mention that my colleagues at the Walters and I, Karen French, a senior conservator of paintings, Glenn Gates, our scientist, and Heyman Park, who is a fellow of ours in paintings conservation, we have been working on this moment where Ethiopian painters were interacting with Italian painters at the Ethiopian court. And in fact, right about now, my colleague Karen French is in Cambridge at the Hamilton Carr Institute presenting at a conference on migrants, meaning the migration of artworks and art materials, about this very moment where you have this combining of cultures and this very symbiotic back and forth trading between Ethiopian artists and Italian artists. So it's a very interesting moment. I should probably put up a painting while I'm talking about this. So at this moment in the 15th century in Ethiopia, we have an incredible and documented painter, Ethiopian painter known as Frey Seyon, and I show you one triptych that's been attributed to him. So this serial imagery really began to appear in Ethiopian painting around the time that the manuscripts I was talking about were made. This striking composition is found frequently in Ethiopian painted icons, which often feature the Virgin and Child surrounded by rows of Old Testament prophets and New Testament apostles. And I show you here, this is a late 15th century icon, again, possibly by Frey Seyon. In the central panel of this triptych, we see a composition much like the one in the manuscript from Munich, with the Virgin and Child flanked, and actually also from the Getty manuscript, flanked by the archangels Michael and Gabriel with their swords drawn. On the left wing of the triptych are the 12 apostles, 4 evangelists, and local Ethiopian saints. And again, you have your Equestrian Saints there. On the right, again, is this Daniel's vision of the Ancient of Days with the 4 beasts, and below, the prophets are seeming to converse. In his writing, Zara Jacob, again, this king who instituted this sort of requirement for churches to have icons of Mary, the apostles were able to see what the prophets were not. And so that is to see Christ, to see the Messiah. So if you look at this triptych, all of the apostles are facing inwards towards Mary, but the prophets in the right panel seem to converse among themselves. They're sort of not seeing her. And another example from the maybe a follower of Frey Seyon from the Walters Art Museum, where again you have this iconic image of the Virgin Mary and the apostles turning in towards her in this very serial arrangement in these different registers. Actually, when I look at this, I think of Carolingian manuscripts. If I think about this sort of format, and where much earlier examples of this sort of format. And to show you here, these 2 triptych wings, so originally there probably would have been a central panel again with a Virgin and Child, but you have the Equestrian Saints now kind of broken out of their registers and arranged in a much more random sort of fashion. I like this particular one because it sort of shows it's almost like they're exploding out of their registers, and you get the sense of their movement, and of course, again, that they would have been on horseback, that sort of thing. But it is, again, this kind of repetition of this equestrian figure that characterizes this panel painting. So now, having seen how pervasive these serial images are, especially in earlier Ethiopian painting, the question remains: why do these images of holy figures displayed in series seem so favored by Ethiopian painters throughout various genres of painting? I would argue that the primary driving factor is liturgical. Eva Balika Witakowska first referred to these repeated images of saints depicted on Ethiopian censals as a painted litany. This presumably refers to Western Christianity's use of repetitious prayers, entreating various saints to pray for the faithful. Indeed, litanies play an important role in the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy. Hapta Mikhael Kedana has laid out 4 different types of litanies used in the Mass and the office. Closest to the imagery I've been discussing would seem to be the short litanies said before or after the lessons, known as Wanebal Quilahana. These are directed to God on behalf of various entities, such as the people, the king, armies, etc., but also for bishops, priests, and deacons. Whoops. Let's see. This repeated referral to clerics mirrors the uniformly laid out series of prophets and apostles found in Getty MS 105, where the eye is drawn along by the shifts in color and the subtle differences in physiognomies and accoutrement of each holy figure. There is a second aspect of Ethiopian liturgy that may explain the strong presence of serial imagery in Ethiopian Christian art. The sometimes seemingly endless rows of figures that appear in Ethiopian manuscripts and paintings evoke the idea of procession. This practice played and still plays a central role in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. For example, Getachew Haile has pointed out that on the Feast of Timkat, which is what you show here, what I'm showing here, which is the celebration of Christ's baptism, the clergy from nearby churches process down to the local river with crosses, tabots, that's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, it's what sanctifies an Ethiopian church, and also with icons. This involves priests, deacons, and the faithful, resulting in a crowded, massive event as you see here. The striking scene very much resembles the assemblage of figures on the icons themselves. And again, here I show the Walters liturgical fan. In fact, many of the objects described above, including icons on wood panel and liturgical fans, were the sorts of things taken out of the churches that possessed them and carried aloft in procession. To conclude, though little studied as a genre, serial imagery is pervasive in Ethiopian painting. Such cycles decorate diverse types of painted objects, including illuminated codices, stencils, parchment liturgical fans, and multi-paneled icons. Future studies of serial imagery in Ethiopian art may include wall paintings in Ethiopian churches, which are frequently arranged in registers, like on panel paintings and manuscripts. And also later icons with multiple folding doors, and these start cropping up in the 18th and 19th century, and there's some really incredible examples that I can show you if you'd like to see them. Even modern Ethiopian paintings of the Kebra Nagast, or the Story of Kings, which tells the foundational story of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and which were popular in the mid-20th century, that's what I'm showing you here, they also display a serial format of narrative imagery that dates back to some of the earliest Ethiopian paintings that survive, and this is an example from the Walters Art Museum. For the past several generations, art historical discussions of Ethiopian painting and Ethiopian art in general have focused primarily on localizing and dating various objects based on stylistic features or also identifying iconography. In a lot of ways, Ethiopian art has fallen through the cracks. It's an African Christian art, not quite fitting with the art of, and yet not quite fitting with the art of other Eastern Orthodox Christianities, nor with the rest of the what is produced on the rest of the African continent. The time is right now, I believe, for a more in-depth examination of Ethiopian art in terms of its modes of representation and how images are read and used. Much has been done for numerous other cultures, in fact, also within Africa. It is only then that Ethiopian art will truly take its rightful place in the art history that we learn and teach today. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you want to come back and stand, or stand here. I don't know. Some questions? Yes.
It seems to me that both your papers, your fascinating papers, each in its own way deals with simultaneously with issues of orality and issues of mobility. And do you need this? No. So I wonder if, especially the orality part, in the Burmese context of the stories, the narratives were those that were memorized as opposed to maybe read or being read while the imagery was being looked at. And similarly, it seems to me for the Ethiopian ones that we're not talking about texts that were being, as I said, read simultaneously with looking at the pictures, but texts that were already known. So that's one aspect. And the mobility has to do with the moving in space of both the object, in the case of the Ethiopian procession fan, and then in the Burmese context, the movement is the devotee moving through that space and moving simultaneously with the narrative, perhaps. Perhaps you can comment on that too. Thank you.
So of course Burmese Buddhist texts, of course, weren't written down until about 500 years after the Buddha lived. So in order to perpetuate that body of text, people memorized it. And so there are certain mnemonic forms that are encoded into into the polycanon. Anyway, in terms of this cause and effect process that you see in the paintings and that you also see in the manuscripts, again, as I said, it links very strongly with that the tradition of narrative, and there are lots of actually other different practices engaged by both monks and lay people to encourage that form of narration. But then there are lots of other things that are encoded that I didn't have time to go into in the paintings themselves in terms of lists. So there are three main sections to the polycanon. The first two deal primarily with narrative. The second primarily deals with lists. So again, these two forms are actually intertwined. In terms of the person progressing, they wouldn't. The temple spaces are so small, as I said, about 10 feet square. So actually you would go in and you'd be seated. And it's more almost that the narratives are wrapping around you. And actually, again, something else I didn't have time to go into, but one of the consecration rituals is that you tie threads to the Buddha image, and then the devotees will hold those threads while you're chanting the stories of the Buddha's previous lives and his life where he becomes a Buddha to that image in order to consecrate it. So this whole form of wrapping the Buddha and the devotee can both be the Buddha preaching to the devotee, but also the devotees and the monks preaching the story to that Buddha image to awaken it. So I think there are actually quite a few things going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. And one aspect that you might not have been thinking about when you asked your question, but of course these are used in a liturgical context. So you have prayer being said in the presence of these, you have singing, and during the processions you have priests walking with and deacons walking with sistra. You might have seen some examples of these in various collections, so these kind of rattles. So you have sound surrounding this, both the spoken word reading of the text and also music as well. So I think it's very performative. And I would actually argue too, just the act of going through really any manuscript is performative, right? You're sort of turning the pages. You might be lifting a silk curtain, right? You're opening and closing your concertina style manuscript. All of these things add to it. Absolutely. So good point.
I was just curious about the palette of the wall murals in the Burmese examples. I noticed and the cloth seemed to be a red and neutral sort of palette, and some of the illuminated manuscripts were much more brilliant. You had one wall painting that was very brilliant. Can you talk any more about those kinds of choices and why that was different for different purposes?
Yeah, so one of the reasons we know that there's this strong interconnection between manuscripts and textiles and the wall paintings is the fact that the color red is used as a background, and anybody who knows about textiles and dyeing knows that actually red is a very, very difficult color to fix, and therefore the textiles that are colored red are particularly valued. So of course, if you're going to make a donation to the Buddha, you're going to definitely donate the maximum you possibly can afford, because of course you're investing for your future lives. So this overlap of this red color, and they use vermilion, is very much tied in with being as luxurious as possible. In terms of the changes in color palettes, as I said, the manuscripts that we have really are very much late 19th century, and a lot of those were produced actually after aniline dyes and those sorts of colors arrived in Burma. So then they're much more brightly colored. Obviously it's foreign, it's imported. Again, it has a luxury implication. There's also a shift in coloration in the late 18th century in Burmese wall paintings, and that's because in 1767, Burma, which was a large empire in its own right, went and sacked the capital of Thailand, which was Ayutthaya, and brought back a lot of Thai artists. And in Thai art, they tended to use a lot of, I haven't looked at this for a while, calcium carbonate, I think it is. No, not calcium carbonate. Anyway, it's a green color, which produces a turquoise color. And so after that, that sacking, then you start seeing the introduction of this kind of turquoise green color in the wall paintings. And I'm sorry that I can't remember technical term for it. But basically, one of the interesting things about Burmese wall paintings is the fact that there's a very stable structure, and they were able to bring in narratives, oral traditions, wall painting styles, manuscript styles, textile styles, and they've put it into their Burmese framework. So they're able to absorb the outside world in a very, very Burmese specific way. Yes, I mean, the coloration is part of that process.
Hi, this is a question really about the Ethiopian concertina books. And forgive me, it's perhaps a really naive question, but the examples that you showed us were from the 16th century, and I presume, given the age of the church in Ethiopia, that there are examples much, much older. And the naive part of this question is, does anybody else see echoes of a Biblia Pauperum in this layout where you have the Old Testament and the New Testament and the relating of the stories?
Well, it's not a silly question, because actually what I showed you were really, like I said, the earliest examples of Ethiopian manuscripts that we have are really 14th century, with this one outlier, Grima Gospels. Now, there was a manuscript tradition before that, but none of that survived, so unclear. So I would say for those stencils, there's sort of a couple of sort of explosions of them, if you will, sort of 15th century, early 16th century, and then the 17th century again. They are still made today. I know of some much more modern examples that exist. And the second part of your question was yes. I don't think they really thought of it that way. The way you see them, I mean, as you see, especially with the Getty manuscript, it kind of starts with the Old Testament prophets and then kind of goes directly into the apostles and into those New Testament figures. So I think they thought of themselves, I mean, it's a continuum, really. It is a little bit compare and contrast, but it's also a continuum. And then as you saw in the triptych, where you do have them completely isolated for sort of, narrative effect, I guess you would say. Yeah, but nothing quite the way you're thinking of it. Yeah, sure.
There's a question right here.
Yes, great talks, especially the Ethiopian Christian one. As someone who's just entering into Ethiopian Christian study, I love how this is finally getting its due course. My question essentially revolves around the figure of Stephanos and whether or not he, as someone who was opposed by both Zara Jacob and David II, who was his predecessor, if you believe that there was any kind of correlation between his opposed teachings and some of the figures in seriality that we see in the Gunda Gunda depictions.
So I didn't get too into Stephanos, but he was thought to be a heretic by Zara Jacob, the emperor, and was eventually sort of banished, and all that sorts of things happened. What's funny about the monasteries that came out of Stephanos, and he was sort of known, the reason why Zara Jacob had a lot of opposition to him was because he opposed these sort of making the Virgin Mary into an icon, to venerate her in that way. He opposed that elevation of the Virgin Mary. However, some of the most wonderful and profuse amounts of Virgin Mary imagery actually come out of Stephanite monasteries. So it's this strange irony where, there must have been some sort of lack of communication, because even though he was thought to be, sort of this, heretic, in fact, they very much were elevating these images of the Virgin Mary. So that's why it's very hard to tell from the artworks to see what we know from history happened, because the images don't actually back it up in any way. They were probably, these Stephanite monasteries were actually producing tons and tons of Marian imagery. So did that answer your question? Okay.
We have time. One more question.
Yes, oh, Sharon.
Hi, thank you both for your papers. This is a really open-ended question, and it's really for both of you. I was just wondering if either of you or both of you could comment a little bit more on artists and connoisseurship and where that fits in your fields. it jumped out at me more with the Ethiopian material because, Christine, you've got a named artist, and then at the Walters you have follower of, which, you know, jumps out to a European trained person as like follower of Hans Memling. And, you know, and kind of wondering how that kind of connoisseurship works and how this attribution of hands plays out in the field as it is now, but also with the Burmese material. You know, in European studies, we talk so much about the authority of artists and whether a particular artist has a greater sort of theological insight. And I would just love to know how that might play out in the context of the works that you study.
You're absolutely right. And what I'm doing here is actually sort of repeating what we've always said at the Walters, because it's a problem. So perhaps even more problematic than Freyseon. And I actually think the diptych, even though we have it attributed to a follower of, I only been at the Walters for a year and a half, so haven't changed everything yet. I think it's pretty close to the man if we can sort of base it on the one signed panel that we have by Freyseon, which is in an Ethiopian church. There's also the issue of these Italian painters who came into Ethiopia, two of whom were documented by name, one of whom was named Niccolo Brancaleone, and we have a painting in our own collection that has been attributed to him. However, if you start to look at all the Niccolo Brancaleone paintings, it's a catch-all for everything that's kind of looks Ethiopian, but not entirely, you know, must have been somebody from outside, you know, that kind of thing. So I think what we really need to do, and this is one kind of what we were trying to get at with the study that my colleague is presenting right now in Cambridge, are we seeing a shift in the materials used when the Italian artists come in? We can sort of do an iconographic looking, a stylistic looking. In those, I think it's quite clear that we have this sort of symbiotic relationship going back and forth. But can we also see any material changes, and can that tell us, you know, do we have an Italian artist here? Do we have an Ethiopian artist at this particular moment? So, you know, I mean, I think because we have so few artist names, it's hard to really do connoisseurship, but you see what I did, right? I mean, I didn't name that artist, but I really think it's the same artist in the Walters leaves and in those Munich leaves. So, and it's not just sort of a similarity. I mean, really, it's exactly, you know, it's the same painting technique, it's the whole thing. So I think it's hard to do, and I don't want to go too far down that path when it comes to Ethiopian art, but it's something that comes up, and people want to hang on to those few names. You know, I think as modern day art historians, we want to hang on to any names that we have, right? So that's part of why we have so many things, and this catch-all of Brancaleone, or even Freyseon to a degree has become a catch-all.
Well, in terms of connoisseurship, no. I mean, there are only two of us who actually deal with this late 17th to early 19th century Burmese wall paintings, and we're the only two who've ever done any of it. I mean, in terms of style, you can definitely see that there are slight shifts in style, and they tend to sometimes group around certain areas, but the whole concept of the artist in Burma is totally different than what you would get in the West, and actually the texts that are being written aren't talking about that process. The texts are simply repeats of traditional Buddhist texts. The important thing is that you're recopying and recopying. So we don't actually have any materials that talk to us about the artist. The few times when we do get mentions, like in royal orders, then it will be generic numbers. So the number 500 is very important. So they'll say things like the 500 artists worked on that temple. Of course, it's if a 10-foot square temple, obviously you're not getting 500 people working on it, but that's just the sort of number that you would use. So in terms of connoisseurship, we just don't have that. In terms of manuscripts, again, it's done in workshops. It was done by monks. Different people worked on different parts of it. And as part of that whole merit-making process, you're not supposed to be putting yourself forward trying to your donation is damaged if you are trying to get some reward for it. Of course, everybody wanted a reward for it, and frequently they did list that, but as part of that, you're getting merit being an artist, but you don't actually want to put your name down. So we have no names until really the late 19th century, when after the British took over, and suddenly then naming your work became important as you participated in colonial forms of artistic production. But before that, no. So connoisseurship really isn't much of an issue.
Thank you. Give one more